In the north of England, we used to build in solid brick and stone. Today, we clad in glass and steel. This is Liverpool 1. The City Fathers have delivered unto the people of Liverpool the biggest city centre shopping development outside London. In fact, since the end of the Second World War. These 42 acres will only ever be shops, temples rising to the sky to celebrate the new gods, the big brands. But once upon a time, when the North built, the world looked on and applauded. The City Fathers then had different ideas of how architecture could contribute to the shape of their cities and improve the lives of their citizens, by lining the streets not with temples to the gods of commerce, but buildings that expressed the grandeur and nobility of a great civilization. Those who gave Liverpool its architectural treasures would inspire other City Fathers right across the north of England. The civic buildings they created would transform the industrial towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire and revolutionize urban landscapes for decades to come. Money, rivalry, ambition and power. Sounds like a Jackie Collins novel, but I'm talking about Victorian architecture in the industrial north of England. 200 years ago, these cities were themselves novel, but a new breed of mercantile princes and governors came to build a raft of civic buildings. To explore those buildings is to uncover the messages that reveal their story. In the 17th century, before the Industrial Revolution, the North looked nothing like it does today. Liverpool, the famous second city of empire, was an insignificant backwater, a small town of just 7 streets. Wars changed all that. With the English Channel littered with French and Dutch warships, the southern ports became too dangerous for merchant sailors. Liverpool offered a safer destination for their cargo, tobacco and sugar from the New World. And so very quickly, the town became a major trading port, and its inhabitants grew very rich indeed on the proceeds. Brian Blundell was one such man, a salty Liverpool sea dog whose life on the high seas, skirmishing with pirates, was the stuff of boy's own adventures. From cabin boy at age 12, he rose to become one of Liverpool's richest sea captains. After nearly 30 years at sea, in 1717 he came home to Liverpool and decided to spend some of his wealth on a project for the public good, a school for poor and orphaned children. The architect of the Blue Coat Chambers is unknown, but this was the English Baroque, the ultra-fashionable style popularised by Sir Christopher Wren, architect of St Paul's. The Blue Coat is the oldest building in Liverpool city centre. A real charmer. I mean, look at it. It's a very pretty building. And it's in what's normally called the Queen Anne style, which to me is the end of the 17th century tradition of classical building. And that tradition is to do with craftsmanship and inventiveness, a certain clumsiness and charm that go hand in hand. Let me show you what I mean. This gate pier. In classical building, you'd call this rustication, which means big, chunky blocks that come from the earth. But here, actually, it's just cut in the shape of timber panelling. Totally illogical, wonderfully charming, but pointless. Through the arches, and you'll realise that you've come through gate piers with pyramids on the top. And this is the way in which you sometimes get the clumsy charm coupled with really profound meaning, because those pyramids are signifiers of a gate between two states. In ancient Egypt, the gateway to the afterlife. And people understood that, these symbols of death. And so for the Georgians then, gateways were the transition point between two spaces. And for children coming into a school, those urchins who came from the city and then made their way through the gates to an education and a new life, pyramids would be the appropriate form. Now, the symmetry of the whole thing and the alignment of all the windows creates this wonderful sense of order when you first see the building. But when you get beyond that basic pattern into the details, that's where Queen Anne buildings can often fall down. Take, for example, that string course. which is a horizontal band of stone dividing 2 stories. You see it starts between the quoin stones. They are the cornerstones that give you a sense of mass and strength on the corner. Well, it's not the same proportion as them. It's just wedged in between them. It's a bit awkward. It is not of the rest of those stones. And it continues, this flat band, going right the way across. It frankly crashes into the door halfway through its moulding. And then it carries on, and where it meets the main range, it just smashes into the side of another quoin stone. The whole thing's a bit of a car crash when you look at the details. It's the way in which the whole thing is not unified consistently, which shows this to be the work of someone who's making it up as he goes along, who is craft-based, and it's not someone who is rigorous. It may be a slightly bodged bit of building, but the Blue Coat did at least appear to meet an urgent social need. In 1795, the writer James Wallace published A General and Descriptive History of the Ancient and Present State of the Town of Liverpool. He wrote of the Blue Coat, "There are in this school 79 orphan children, 143 fatherless children, and 58 whose parents are in indigent circumstances. They are completely clothed, lodged and dieted. The boys are taught reading, writing and arithmetic, and those intended for sea are instructed in navigation. The girls are taught reading, writing, sewing, spinning, knitting and housewifery. Children are admitted at 8 years of age and put out apprentices at 14. The patrons may have felt they were offering poor children a life of relative privilege and comfort, but that's not the whole story. Lawrence, how were the Blue Coat children treated?
Well, for many of the children, it was a real step up. You know, 3 meals a day, an education. A lot of these children would have been little more than street urchins. But probably most disturbingly, if your child came to the school, you lost all rights to how they would be apprenticed when they came to leave. It was the responsibility of Blundell.
So where did Blundell's money come from?
Well, Blundell traded mainly with the Chesapeake area of North America, transported tobacco. He was also involved in transporting what we call refuse slaves, terrible term. And that was slaves that had been working with sugar. And sugar is such a labour-intensive crop that slaves would basically become exhausted after a very short period of time. And he would take these slaves, which you could buy on the cheap, up to the Chesapeake to work on tobacco, which was a less labour-intensive crop. So it was a form of speculation. So he was basically a slave trader and a tobacco merchant. If you go to the records office, you can see book after book of indentures, where apprentices are literally, their lives are being signed away in the name of Brian Blundell to go and work on board slave ships or to go and work on the plantations of the Chesapeake or in the Caribbean. And many of those children would have never seen their parents ever again or seen Liverpool.
So Liverpool's slave culture is endemic. It's so ingrained that what seems to be a philanthropic project actually fuels slave culture.
African children also came to be educated here, and many of them would go back to Africa to help to facilitate trade because they would have a good command of English after spending a few years at the school. So it was a place that it certainly had a purpose. It wasn't necessarily just for the benefit of the children who came here.
Now, I've learned something from the Blue Coat. It's not that there's a strong link between trade and philanthropy in early 18th century Liverpool. I mean, this stuff's got to be paid for somehow. It is the depth of self-interest that this early school building represents. A really uncomfortable link between charity and brutality. Throughout the 18th century, Liverpool was controlled by men like Blundell, the traders, businessmen and merchants who made up the corporation. It was a closed shop of cronies, unelected sons who succeeded their fathers on point of death. They looked after the town's needs, but chiefly they looked after their own.
In the 3 decades since Blundell built the Bluecoat, Liverpool had prospered to such an extent it needed a new symbol of civic identity. This is Liverpool Town Hall.
The chosen architect was the fashionable designer John Wood of Bath. Wood's buildings were essays in the style of one of the most influential architects of all time, the 16th century Italian genius Andrea Palladio. An important principle of Palladian buildings is that they're bound by symmetry, geometry and number in firm proportion. They're about the creation of order using a flexible repertoire of classical elements. And what better way to convince the people of your town that you're in control than to make an example of order in the design of your town hall?
In this case, the typical features are these: the rusticated base which elevates the main rooms up to the first floor level, called the piano nobile. The use of the classical column on the side to give a sense of metre and rhythm and proportion. One really crucial feature, and this is what Palladio is quite famous for, is the application of a temple front to a building. It gives it a sense of centrality, of balance and nobility, and positioned at the end of Castle Street, this is a monument Liverpool couldn't ignore. But the new town hall wasn't all order and restraint. To glance between the sculptured capitals is to go on a virtual safari as you encounter a crocodile, an elephant, a lion and hyenas, not to mention the heads of African characters. Clearly, in the 1740s, the slave trade was nothing to be embarrassed about. It was to be shouted from the rooftops to all people for all time.
But neither the slaves whose sweat paid for this building, nor the workers whose sweat actually built it, were ever allowed inside. Everything that lay beyond that front door was strictly off limits to all but the city elite.
John Wood's fine town hall marked the heart of modern Liverpool. The exchange on the ground floor and these reception rooms above are simply two sides of the same golden coin, because those same merchants who traded in the daytime traded the business of politics in these rooms in the evening.
Wood's name lent cachet to the project. He was commissioned to create a building both functional and seductive, where Liverpool's legendary corporate hospitality could grease the wheels of trade. Now, Joseph, to what extent was this town hall a real seat of government?
Well, municipal government in the late 18th and early 19th century was on a much more modest scale from what we're used to today. So the government of the town was confined to a few rooms on the ground floor of the building, but the most important function of the building was on the first floor and was the provision of space for entertainment, a suite of rooms for banqueting, for balls and meetings of that kind.
So tell us how this place was used for entertaining.
Well, Liverpool was a great commercial centre, had a constant stream of VIP visitors from overseas, and this is the place where they were entertained by the town, and so there were constantly parties and balls and things of that kind taking place in these rooms.
One thing that strikes me, Joseph, about this town hall is that if you compared it to a building in, let's say, Florence or Rome, it is essentially a palace, isn't it? It's a palazzo. It's a square building with the noise and the dirt of commerce at the ground floor. And elevated above it is this grand suite of rooms with gilding and formal reception and so on. I mean, this is a grand mercantile palace, isn't it?
Yes, I think what you just described is true, and it's a kind of microcosm of Liverpool, this affluent lifestyle for the few, based on commercial activity at a lower level.
Palladio was from the Republic of Venice, an independent city-state which derived its wealth and its power from its position as a strategic trading port. It may be no accident that Liverpool chose the Palladian style for its town hall. The northern towns could never compete architecturally with London, but by emulating other great cities of the past, they sent out a message as to how they wished to be seen.
It's tempting to walk past this fine town hall and think of 18th century Liverpool as simply a place of growth and prosperity. But for some contemporary observers, it had a serious image problem.
Indeed, the intellectual life of the town was described as a barren waste. All money, no class. The very same men who were prepared to spend fortunes on beautiful architecture also frequented rowdy societies like the Ugly Club, essentially a drinking club where the merchants would sing bawdy songs and fine each other for failing to consume enough alcohol. Condition of entry, an ugly face. Any member who married would be disbarred, and if an uglier man joined, well then the least ugly member would be ejected. There were, however, some voices speaking out against all this Philistinism. One such voice belonged to William Roscoe, a man of gentle manners and thoughtful mind. When Roscoe died, they said he was a man too civilized for his own town. Born the son of a publican, he was entirely self-taught, a barrister, amateur botanist, and keen art collector. His wife Jane once sent him out to buy apples, and he came back with a painting. His collection of medieval Italian art hangs today in the Walker Art Gallery. Roscoe also wrote a best-selling biography of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Renaissance banker, diplomat, and artistic patron, and for many, the father of mercantile philanthropy.
Roscoe's biography contained a thesis which set the model for the Victorian relationship with culture. He argued that the glories of Renaissance Florence weren't due to the established church or to the aristocracy. It was down to Lorenzo himself, who ushered in a period of peace and let the self-made manufacturers and merchants spend their wealth on works of art. It was they who translated personal magnificence into common munificence, quite a standard to set for Liverpool.
Roscoe himself put his money where his mouth was and became a key player in the formation of the Liverpool Athenaeum. That name, Athenaeum, it was chosen specifically to link a northern English town with Athens, the civilization whose golden age produced many of the great philosophers, artists, and scientists of antiquity. London and many other cities would later build Athenaei of their own, but Liverpool's was the very first. The original building was demolished in 1928, but its replacement still upholds the same Athenian values. David, what was the inspiration for the Athenaeum and why in Liverpool?
Well, of course, in 1797, when the Athenaeum was founded, Liverpool was a fairly rich city, and the only place you could read papers was in the coffee shops, and they were crowded and noisy, and the people couldn't always get the papers they wanted. So a group of people got together and founded the Athenaeum, really as a quiet place to come and read the papers.
So how did the Athenaeum contribute to the culture of 19th century Liverpool?
It's certainly a library. It's certainly a club. I mean, one of the great strengths is that you've got all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, political, religious, and so on, who like to have an intellectual conversation.
Roscoe and his fellow Athenaeum members were abolitionists and progressive thinkers. They believed a modern city had to be more than just a place of commercial exchange. It should be a focus for culture, learning, and sociability. As those ideas gained in currency, so the turn of the century saw an increase in gentlemen's clubs and institutes devoted to arts and science across the north. And guess which architectural style they chose for the exteriors of their buildings?
Liverpool's Lyceum was Europe's first lending library. Designed by Thomas Harrison in 1802, this fine little building has good, strong bones, Greek bones at that, and a Greek name. And there are 3 Greek characters that convey a message about Liverpool's identity. On that side is a geographer, possibly Eratosthenes, mapping the world with his dividers. On this side is Hermes, god of communication and commerce, about to send a packet of something somewhere. In the middle is Apollo, god of the arts, music, poetry. Put those 3 together, and you get a sense of what Liverpool's all about. Exploration begets commerce, begets culture.
Liverpool was fast becoming the Athens of the north. Stung into action, Manchester's merchants struck the first blow in what would become a game of architectural one-upmanship. They recruited the man who built Liverpool's Lyceum, Thomas Harrison, and instructed him to build their handsome portico library. And it didn't stop there. The next thing Manchester built would signal the arrival of a remarkable talent. Just 100 yards from the portico is the Royal Manchester Institution, a building for the promotion of art paid for by the town's mill owners. They invited architects to enter an open competition to win the commission. Triumphant was a callow 29-year-old who would go on to become one of the greatest British architects of all time.
The plans of the winner, Charles Barry, were widely circulated and drew the admiration even of the king himself, George IV. What they represent is a very practical realization of all the criteria of the competition brief in a Greek revival design. You'll see the Greek style in the Ionic columns and the Greek sculpture. But Barry went on his grand tour in 1817, aged 22, and he reached as far as Egypt. And you'll see in the raking shape of the windows and even some little hint in the curving cornice that there's some inspiration from Egypt here as well. Like all the other contenders, Barry submitted his design under a motto. The one he chose was nihil pulchrum nisi utile. Beauty is nothing without utility. His building is a manifestation of that principle.
In keeping with Barry's neoclassical theme, the vestibule was decorated with casts of the Parthenon marbles, whilst upstairs were large and practical rooms to display the art. The institution provided the people of Manchester with a building to inspire and educate. Right next door to it is another Barry building, Manchester's own Athenaeum, built almost 40 years after Liverpool's. But there is a difference. Whereas Liverpool's Athenaeum was very much an exclusive gentleman's club for affluent subscribers, the Manchester version was a genuine adult education institute intended to provide cultural opportunities for blue-collar workers. There it is, hewn into the stone, for the advancement and diffusion of knowledge. Charles Dickens spoke at its annual general meeting in 1846. I think it's grand to know that while her factories re-echo with the clanking of stupendous engines and the whirl and rattle of machinery, the immortal mechanism of God's own hand, the mind, is not forgotten in the din and uproar, but is lodged and tended in a palace of its own. Charles Barry would go on to find fame as the designer of the Houses of Parliament, but the Gothic revival had yet to reach Manchester. At this point, the appropriate language for civic architecture was still that of classical civilization. It isn't hard to work out why the burghers of England's northern towns found the architecture of ancient Greece so appealing. The age of the Grand Tour was in full swing. The privileged class of architects could now travel to Greece and behold the wonders of the ancient world with their own eyes. The fashion for all things Greek was further fueled by the work of romantic poets like Byron and Lord Elgin's exhibition of stunning marbles from the Parthenon. The men who paid for these buildings believed this monumental architecture was good for the common man. The rapidly expanding cities with all their attendant crime and squalor were unsettling, unstable, and even uncivilized places to live. But to emulate Greek aesthetics was to emulate the cradle of civilization itself. The Bible for all this Greek building was Stuart and Revitt's Antiquities of Athens, which provided architects with a pattern book of authentic Greek detail. Sadly, too many failed to adhere rigorously to the principles identified in the book. Playing fast and loose with the rules resulted in an architectural mishmash. By the time the Manchester Athenaeum was built in 1836, Liverpool was already preparing its response. The game of architectural one-upmanship was about to enter a new phase. In 1827, the Liverpool architect John Foster Jr. built this, the Oratory, a mortuary building which now stands just beneath the city's magnificent Anglican cathedral. Foster, who had previously visited Greece during his own grand tour of Europe, showed the fastidiousness of the true purist in what is his last surviving masterwork.
The columns of this building are different outside to inside. The outside ones are Doric. They seem to derive from typically buildings like the Parthenon on the Acropolis. And these internal columns are also from the Acropolis. They're from the nearby Erechtheion, and they're of the Ionic order, a more feminine order than Doric. It's actually associated with learning, as if they're scrolls of parchment to be pulled out in a way that Plato or his acolytes might have done at the Athenian Academy. Beautifully carved. The egg and dart moulding in particular is this Greek device that the Romans then used by the mile. But everything is harmonious, integrated, proportional. And the quality of the curves on those spirals is just endlessly elegant. Liverpool architect James Picton said that the city used Greek architecture in all possible and some almost impossible situations. By impossible, he was thinking of modern many-windowed buildings like houses, banks, offices, even gin palaces, to which maybe a couple of Greek details might be added. This happy survival shows us, though, what Greek architecture was capable of in temple form, and it's a real testament to Foster's skill.
John Foster was the town surveyor, as his father had been before him. He was a corporation man, but he was to be one of the last. In 1835, Parliament passed a key piece of legislation. The Municipal Corporations Act signalled an end to the old ways. For Liverpool's corporation, it meant out with the cronies and in with a new, democratically elected council, keen to make its mark on the landscape with a new civic building. What the town needed were law courts and a jail to act as a criminal deterrent. What the council wanted was a concert hall to represent the improving tonic of high art. And so in 1839, an advert was placed in the newspaper. They already had a name for their building, St. George's Hall. They'd even, bizarrely, already laid the foundation stone. All they needed was an architect who could take their civic ideals and transform them into stone.
The idea was to rebrand the city of Liverpool. Until 1807, it had made much of its money from the slave trade. But now, as Victoria took to the throne, it had the chance to show itself in a new light. A city of commerce which could turn its wealth into virtues. Artibus, legibus, consiliis, to arts, laws and councils. The foremost of those was arts.
From 86 entries, the council chose a design by a young London architect, Harvey Lonsdale Elms. Just 25 years old, with a head full of ideas and nothing on his CV, he would provide Liverpool with one of the finest neoclassical buildings in the world.
A lot of people find classical architecture a bit forbidding, as if the weight of authority is just too heavy. But Elms himself thought that if you just were slavishly copying details, that really evades the point. The idea is to be bold and original. And as the committee were making up their minds exactly what kind of building they wanted here, it was the boldness and originality that won them over, because this building doesn't express the functions within it, the law court, the concert hall. The whole thing has a very picturesque envelope, which speaks very different language on each of its four sides.
Elms had a difficult job. He had to combine the separate functions of concert hall and courts with all their attendant needs, space for an organ, a library, juries, witnesses and solicitors. But above all, the building had to send a message. Charles Dickens referred to it as Liverpool's front office. It told you, when you came out from the newly built Lime Street station, that you'd arrived in a town you could do business with.
I reckon part of Elm's genius is in the way that he manages to be both monumental and picturesque at the same time, because when you first see St George's Hall, it looks like a great rectangular Roman temple, but come round to this end and you'll see a circular temple, something maybe from Tivoli in Rome, and it's just attached to the end. This is like a greatest hits of ancient buildings, and he's put them all together and smoothed out the junctions and made something quite distinctive and original. Portico is the most familiar temple part of the building. It looks like the front of some great Roman or Greek temple.
Its classical features meant very poetic and evocative things. The line of slender Corinthian columns with their elaborate capitals are said to derive from the proportions of a woman holding a basket of acanthus leaves on her head.
And up there is the Greek quay, which Grecian buildings have. This is a double-decker one. It's layer upon layer of that kind of squared spiral. And this is what Elms really knocks your socks off with as you approach the building. You see this temple, you see the decoration, and everyone must have been impressed when they saw it. Obviously, even today, Becker and Kazza and Keegs like to associate themselves with it.
How was the completed building greeted by Liverpool and the nation?
Marvellous. The opening ceremony is one of the great weeks of the Liverpool press. Everybody thought it was brilliant, and then the complaints started. Seats, toilets, sound, couldn't get any food, couldn't get in. Oh, but it's a good building though, isn't it? It was wonderful. It was all the usual glorious Liverpool comments that you get from September 1854 right through that week. Everybody loved it and everybody complained.
So it was, in fact, an accident that the two separate designs for law courts and music hall were both won by the same person. Had there been two separate winners, they may not have coalesced into one building.
The coalition of the two buildings is wonderful because it provides us with the two opposites of the Victorian age in one spot. The joy of being in this room for some of the great events of the 19th century to the misery of being in the courts. And often that purgatory was in the same day, within the same hour. There'd been one of these vast annual events in here. And this lady wrote to the local paper and she said, during the evening, I went out for some fresh air with my beau, that's boyfriend. And she says, on the staircase, there are bars. And it feels as though you are in a prison. And the editor just put underneath, madam, it is a prison.
One of the hall's most glorious features is its Minton floor, a mosaic of over 30,000 individually fired clay tiles. It prompted the prominent 19th century architect Richard Norman Shaw to describe the hall as a swimming pool with no water and no deep end. However, it's so fragile and precious that it sits permanently beneath protective boards and is only unveiled once every 10 years or so. Steve, tell me the story behind this fabulous but hidden Minton floor.
Have you heard the story about Liverpool? They've built a floor so famous they've had to cover it up so no one can see it. That was one of the national reactions to this extraordinary project. I think its unattainability, its mystery, has aided it. The floor has gained a kind of heroic mysticism, basically because nobody can see it, except every so often when they can.
Now, one central question I've got in my journey to understand the value of Victorian civic buildings is who they were designed for and whose lives they improved. Did it elevate the bottom of the social pyramid?
Yeah, I think it did. The people elevate themselves to some extent, but to do that, they've got to be given a chance where they can move beyond mere survival. And you can't really elevate or organise or think about things until you're not starving, until you know that on Friday you're going to get 9 shillings or 10 shillings. Because of that, because of the precarious nature of life here, because of the casual nature of most of the employment, it was unsettling, it was on the edge, it was precarious, but this elevation there needed to be a road put down, no matter how bumpy and difficult that road was, so people could essentially elevate themselves.
To name the hall after St. George is to evoke the ancient Christian message of good versus evil. And when this magnificent edifice was being built, evil was all around in superabundance. The streets of Liverpool were throbbing with crime, squalor, immorality, and disease. In the minutes of council meetings, there's constant reference to the phrase, second city of empire. But what sort of empire was it that reduced the life expectancy of the working men of its second city to just 20 years, and where nearly half of its children were dead before the age of 10? You can't help feeling that Liverpool's improvers sought to create something of such goodness, such inherent value, that it would elevate the whole city, as the slaying of the dragon did with St. George. As the building went up, the numerous stresses associated with its construction began to take their toll on young Elms, and under doctor's orders to rest, his visits to the site became less frequent. He was eventually diagnosed with consumption, tuberculosis, and yet from his sickbed, Elms continued to conduct operations through letters to his friend, the engineer Robert Rawlinson.
On December 7th, 1847, Rawlinson
was sent a letter. It was in a shaky hand. It ran, "My dear sir, you will, I'm sure, be much grieved to hear that poor Mr. Elms is no more. He died after much suffering on Friday last." It was from Mrs. Elms, and it was the last correspondence he would receive. The great tragedy is that Elms never got to see his building completed. He died aged just 33, and the project was finished off by Charles Robert Cockerell. It was Cockerell who provided Liverpool's music lovers with the more intimate small concert room, a gloriously opulent circular space which sits at the building's north end.
You can't help but think of young Elms. Well, he's in his mid-20s, isn't he? Sitting scratching away with hardly any other experience of architecture, taking on this enormous burden on his shoulders. You can feel the weight of this building on him. But what he creates with Cockerell completing this decoration is so substantial, it's so extraordinary. It's a testimonial not only to the civic vision of Liverpool to have this thing done, but of a leap of faith in a designer, an architect, a person of vision to bring together all of these, sometimes competing themes into one astonishing, self-contained, beautiful space. It's a lasting tribute to Elms.
St George's Hall took 15 years to build, but during that time it kick-started a wave of competitive building throughout the north. It not only showed other towns what classical architecture looked like, it gave them the confidence to do likewise. In Bradford, where they pride themselves on a no-nonsense approach, it was believed they could knock one up a little quicker. No frills, no law courts or jail cells. This was to be a concert hall, pure and simple. Subscribers were canvassed, and the biggest donor was the splendidly named Titus Salt. Bradford's paterfamilias, Salt was a Victorian all-rounder, mill owner, mayor, philanthropist, and much loved in his hometown. The architects he chose were the local firm of Lockwood and Mawson.
With the political weight, momentum and finance of Titus Salt, Lockwood and Mawson provided a perfectly adequate and workable design. It was never going to be as inspired as St George's Hall, Liverpool, but nonetheless, as a classical block, it fitted in well with the existing warehouses of Bradford. The columns give you a sense that there's something going on inside, but it has none of the wit or bravura you might expect from a major place of entertainment. Nonetheless, Lockwood and Mawson finished their St George's Hall in just 2 years, well ahead of Liverpool's exemplar, and what they provided was a major venue for the people of Bradford. Now, inside the building, Lockwood and Mawson provided a superb musical venue. Acoustically, it's nigh perfect. Functionally, you can get up to a couple of thousand people in here, and it's put up with 2 fires and about 19 shades of blancmange, and is still packing them in. A Victorian venue doing what it was designed to.
Titus Salt and the rest of Bradford's civic leaders were immensely proud of their new building. They felt the speed of its creation reflected the dynamism of the industrial elite. And as a bonus, it was one in the eye for the rival mill towns of Yorkshire.
Bradford's success with St George's Hall grated on the people of Leeds, and they needed a new civic symbol. In fact, more than that, more even than the description town hall would account for, because the express ambition for this was a noble municipal palace. The problem is there's only £20,000, and 16 people joined the competition to design it. The winner, the person who could achieve so much for so little, was a relative unknown. Step forward, Mr. Cuthbert Broderick.
Like so many of the successful architects of the time, Broderick was absurdly young. A 29-year-old from Hull, he articled under Lockwood and Mawson and travelled in Italy and France at his father's expense. Indeed, he still lived with his parents. Mrs. Broderick may still have been doing her son's laundry, but he was about to make her very proud. When the subject of a new town hall was raised, John Heaton, the secretary of Leeds Improvement Society, made a poetic case for one.
If a noble municipal palace that might fairly vie with some of the best town halls of the continent were to be erected in the middle of our hitherto squalid and unbeautiful town, it would become a practical admonition to the populace of beauty and art, and in course of time men would learn to live up to it.
Broderick had seen the best town halls on the continent. His time in Paris had instilled in him a love of French architecture, bureaucratic buildings whose grand scale was befitting of a king's residence.
And Broderick delivered them a palace. What you've got are columns on a gigantic scale with classical sculptures over the doors, all the right ingredients. It looks like a pavilion from Versailles has broken loose and is making its way to the Yorkshire Dales for its holidays. You know, any great building's got to manage the double whammy of welcoming you graciously and then knocking your socks off, and the vestibule of Leeds Town Hall really does that. There is the rich Minton floor, and you would have been greeted in the middle by Queen Victoria here, so she'd have seen you head on when you came in and reminded you that she travelled up from London to give this place a blessing in front of the people of Leeds. But when Albert died, she was put to one side, Albert to the other, and she is about the most elegant introduction to the corridor toward the loos you could wish for. And then you see the vaulted ceiling, rich in its gilding and its colour. It tells you that Leeds is not just a provincial town. It's not just important to the north of England, but there is Europe, there is America, and Africa, and Asia, with Australia included by default. But you get the point. This is a world city. But you know, all this is just a taster. It's an amuse-bouche compared to the room that comes after it. That is the main dish, and boy, is it substantial. By the 1840s, Colin, did Leeds set itself up against the bigger industrial cities to the west of the Pennines, or was it more a dialogue with the woolen towns to the east?
Well, the real rivalry was Bradford, and Bradford had got a good architect to build the St George's Hall, a wonderful great concert hall. They were ahead of Leeds on that, and I think there was real rivalry. This town hall was to be bigger and better than the St George's Hall in Bradford, and by the time it was built they were up for running special excursion trains from Bradford to bring the people from Bradford to look and admire.
Did the commissioners know precisely what they were looking for, or was this down to the creative genius of the architects?
I think there were people commissioning it who dreamed of a great palace for Leeds, but Broderick was a genius of a designer, and he had a real imaginative streak in him that could produce unforgettable shapes.
Now, Broderick was, what, 29 at this point? He was an unknown as an architect and still lived at home with his parents. Did the commissioners have faith in him, or was there nervousness about this ingenue?
The one thing in his favour was that his design was selected by Charles Barry. You couldn't have a better backer than that. With Barry saying here was a young man he could have confidence in, a man who could be relied on to produce anything that was needed, then the town council felt happy to go ahead on that recommendation.
What did the people of Leeds think to it?
Oh, tremendous, tremendous popularity. Once the building went up, people in Leeds really liked it. And thousands of people turned out to see it, tens of thousands. The silhouette, those massive columns, that sumptuous tower soaring into the sky, it became almost the symbol for civic architecture of the North East. There's nothing like it anywhere else.
At the time, perhaps. But it's subsequently been emulated and copied not just across the north, not even the country, but the British Empire. Without a clock tower, a 19th century town hall seems hardly to deserve the name.
How many times a day do you do this, Eric?
As little as possible. Mind your head when you come through the door.
There's a bit of a squeeze, I've got to tell you. But God, what a view! So for 150 years it stood as a landmark, but what's it used for today?
Leeds Town Hall's a hall for hire. We have conferences, dinners, concerts on a Saturday night. There's organ recitals on a Monday. If you want to hire the hall, you can hire the hall. It's of for the people and for the people.
So 150 years on, you would argue that it still fulfills the function it was designed for. That Broderick, his brief, was to create a performance space to elevate the people of Leeds. It still does that?
Most definitely.
Could I hire it as well? Because I'm from Lincolnshire originally, what Yorkshire people call a yellow belly, and I can still hire it.
We'll have your money off you.
That's the civic spirit, Eric.
Despite providing Leeds with two more fabulous buildings in the Corn Exchange and the Mechanics Institute, work dried up for Broderick. After years of his competition entries being rejected, he retired to France, where he died in obscurity in 1905. And as the classical revival spread from Liverpool to Bradford to Leeds and beyond, smaller towns were also caught up in the fever. This is Todmorden, 23 miles west of Leeds.
You know, at first glance, Todmorden Town Hall looks like a late offspring of Birmingham Town Hall, 40 years its junior, but it speaks a very special language about its location and the people who built it. This is the Calder River, and it runs straight underneath the building. It straddles Yorkshire to its right and Lancashire to its left. And you see that in the sculpture of the tympanum, the triangular section in the middle of the pediment on the top. You've got twin sisters of Lancashire and Yorkshire with their arms round each other. It's all very endearing. To the left, commerce of Lancashire, the making of bobbins and the production of cotton. And on the right, the agricultural produce of Yorkshire. The two are brought together in symbiosis. Now, that union of Lancashire and Yorkshire, of course, has a longer history. And in the entablature, the stone beam carried by the columns, you see the Tudor rose, the reconciliation of warring Lancashire and Yorkshire at the end of the Wars of the Roses in the Tudor dynasty. Now, given that this is a manufacturing area, the whole thing is an extraordinary testament to the skill in local mason craft, from the sculpture in the pediment through to those fine columns with their very florid capitals, the window surrounds. It's a major triumph in a minor town.
By the 1870s, a spider's web of neoclassical buildings had been spun from the northwest across the Pennines to Yorkshire and beyond. But elsewhere in Britain, in particular London and Manchester, the Gothic revival began to take hold. Leading the charge was the architect Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who denounced classical architecture as decadent and pagan. Yet, despite the spectacular Gothic successes of Manchester and elsewhere, Liverpool stuck to its guns. The city fathers even upped the architectural ante by transforming a shabby stretch of heathland known as Shaw's Brow into the culmination of their civic ambition. They created a classical forum, a group of buildings which would emulate the governmental and intellectual centre of ancient Rome. Liverpool's Forum began life with the Library and Museum, opened in 1860 and paid for by William Brown, a canny and exceptionally wealthy Ulster banker. Such was the scale of his generosity, the equivalent of more than £26 million in today's earnings, that Brown received a knighthood and Shaw's Brow was renamed in his honour. 17 years later, William Brown Street had its next civic building, the Walker Art Gallery. As a thank you to the city for making him mayor, local brewing magnate Andrew Barclay Walker personally funded its construction, the equivalent of £13 million from his own pocket. He too was knighted for his generosity.
But not everyone was happy. One extraordinary illustration shows the Walker Art Gallery as pretty much a gin palace covered with the statistics of misery in Liverpool, of the poor and the destitute. And in fact, there's a prostitute with a bottle, a beggar with his begging tin, and the devil himself sitting on a ton of Walker's XXX. No one forgot that Walker had made his money from providing Liverpool with alcohol.
The final piece of the jigsaw was slotted into place in 1879, a drum-shaped building designed by Cornelius Sherlock.
This fantastic space, this temple to learning, is the last great building to contribute to Liverpool's new forum. The Picton Reading Room was placed between the museum and library that way and the Walker Art Gallery in that direction. Outside, it responds to the curve of the small concert room in St. George's Hall. Inside, it embraces an entire city who want to read in this space. And the fact it was built at all is due to one man, James Picton. There he is. He spent almost 40 years of his life campaigning for public libraries. There's only one fault with it. The acoustics stink.
When the reading room opened, a banquet was held in Picton's honour. He gave a speech. At the beginning of the last century, Lancashire was the most backward-looking county in England, and Liverpool was about the most backward town in Lancashire. Small, ill-built and poverty-stricken, its emergence seemed all but hopeless. Look at what a century and three-quarters have done for us.
The Picton Library essentially completed the transformation of Shaw's Brow. It gave Liverpool an exemplary collection of classical buildings, prototypes that could be rolled out across the north of England. And as an ensemble, they gave Britain its closest approximation of a Roman forum. Classical architecture was supposed to evoke the grandeur of past civilizations, but was that really enough in 19th century Britain? Architecture, after all, couldn't put bread in the mouths of the poor, it couldn't heal the sick or provide a cure for cholera. Instead, it's about the government that happens within these buildings. That's what really matters. Architecture, after all, is merely a stage set. It requires the actors to play their part.
By the time Liverpool completed its forum, the classical style was in abeyance. Instead of looking to ancient Greece for inspiration, the civic leaders of Manchester, Rochdale and elsewhere were looking to the great buildings of the medieval world. They were the agents of a new Gothic revival, which, with its pointed arches, gargoyles and spires, was the perfect style for exhibiting the skills of northern craftsmen. It granted town planners new freedoms to depart from the rigid principles of classical architecture, and its associations with church building and Christianity were powerful antidotes to the pagan temples of Athens and Rome. Thanks to the rising prosperity of England's northern industrial towns, Gothic architecture would transform public spaces, leaving a second civic legacy that survives right up to the present day.
Stay with us. The next part of the People's Palaces, the golden age of civic architecture, is coming up next.